I love our grant making, but I want to make our investments feel like our grant making.
Welcome to Market Makers, a podcast that explores the driving forces behind innovation and inclusion in today's economy. My name is Troy Duffie, Director of Financial Markets at the Milken Institute. We often think that organizing and philanthropy don't go together. If anything, the two are diametrically opposed in our worlds. Activism is about upending systems. Philanthropy can often be seen as a part of it. But what happens when the two meet? In our interview with the new president of the New York Foundation, our friend Ricke, we explore what happens when an activist leads a large private foundation. We also dive in deep on the impact of the foundation's endowment and the impact it can have on our community. Let's dive in.
Hi, I'm Lenore Beirne. I'm the managing partner at Bright Ventures, and I'm really excited to be here with Troy Duffie and Ricke Mananzala, who are going to explore the history of the New York Foundation, the future of New York City, and how all that is connected to inclusive capitalism.
Awesome. My name is Troy Duffie. I'm Director of Financial Markets at the Milken Institute. So happy to have Ricke on today. In this episode, we're going to explore how one innovator is leading in the foundation space to make New York City more inclusive. So Ricke, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, first, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Great to be here.
Absolutely.
So I currently at the New York Foundation as president. Been at the foundation for about 3 years now, but I have a longer history with the foundation. Dates back over 20 years ago. But aside from telling you that history, I should probably tell you what the New York Foundation focuses on.
Will you please?
Yeah. So we have a long history of funding community organizing here in New York City. We're one of the oldest foundations in the country, founded in 1909. But I'd say the history of the foundation's commitment to community organizing for racial, economic, gender, and now climate justice was really in the past several decades. And so as a foundation, we've supported a number of grassroots initiatives across the city. People, everyday people, just coming together in their communities to identify challenges and solutions to those challenges that were truly led by communities themselves. Our belief that change doesn't come from the top down, but it comes from communities coming together to build power for transformative change. Now, my history with the foundation is what really drives my current role and how I approach my current role, which was as a grantee of the foundation over 20 years ago.
Wow.
My roots are in community organizing and advocacy. Here in the city, it's something I'm very proud of. I came up as a young person organizing in the streets at actions around racial, economic, gender justice, and LGBT rights issues, issues that were very personal to me and my communities. And so getting involved in organizing was a really transformative experience. The first funder I actually met, which I didn't really understand philanthropy. I knew I was at a nonprofit. I knew I was doing organizing, but I'll never forget one of the first funders I met was the New York Foundation. And what felt so unique about that experience compared to other funders that I had met in my work along the line was that I felt like they really believed in us, that as young people of color in particular who didn't get a lot of support from philanthropy, organizations that still struggle to get access to grants, that I felt like they really trusted us as young people of color, that they trusted our vision for change, and that they really believed in community organizing as a strategy for change. And so I'm just so honored now to be in this full circle moment, helping to lead a foundation that's been deeply impactful to the organizing community here in the city.
What an amazing story. And I do think that issue of proximity, like you've been there. And so it does put you in this unique position to relate to and support the grantees. But I want to push even further to understand, like you've played all these different roles, I think, in building an inclusive New York City. From this role today, like what's special about this role that you can accomplish or that you have vision for?
I love this question because it's almost going to be ironic, the answer. So when
you're
trained...
the new president. You were recently
I was
promoted.
Recently promoted to president. I started off as an executive director a couple of years ago and then was recently promoted. Thank you. And the training you get as an organizer, kind of the basic foundation for how we understand how change happens, you're kind of told this simple story of power. Power is either you have a lot of money and ability to influence conditions, where you have a lot of people.
Yeah.
And as organizers, we know, especially the communities we are working with that have been historically marginalized from seats of power, we have to rely on each other, our people power, because we don't necessarily have the money power to make change. And so what I'm saying is ironic about that is here I now sit in philanthropy.
Right.
And my main tool to help support change is money and other resources to help spur change in communities. And so while I have now money as a tool, when I was previously doing organizing for with communities and people, my money still has, or not my money, the New York Foundation's money. It's certainly not my money. I'm grateful to steward these resources. They are not my own. But seeing the role of foundations in particular and supporting people-powered change. It's not that organizing is all about just the people. Like, it still takes resources to do the work. And so here I now sit at a foundation.
Right.
My tool is to leverage my power, which is the resources we have, to support community organizing. And the thing in particular that I've been the most enthusiastic about as a foundation is a new area for the foundation and even myself, is going beyond grant making, right? So as a private foundation, for those that are listening, there's some distinctions, right? So private foundations versus public foundations. A public foundation is a public charity. It raises its money and it re-grants it out. We are a private foundation, which means we have an endowment. And that endowment is invested to make financial returns to then support our charitable grant making, right? So what most people think about with foundations is the grants, right? Of course, that's the primary business that we're in this work to do. But what about, we're only required by the IRS to give out 5% of our endowment.
Explain what that means for folks who don't understand what that means.
Right. So say we have $100 million in our endowment. We're only required to give out 5% of that $100 million towards charitable activities, grants, to nonprofit organizations, while the rest of the 95% can stay invested, typically, of course, in public equities and other types of investments, to generate financial return. That is the endowment's primary purpose, financial return. The grant making that comes from that 5% is the charitable work. And I'm coming into this foundation being like, okay, like I come out of organizing. I'm like, well, wait a minute. You're always asking, like, where's the power?
Right.
And the power is not just in that 5%. It's what's the 95% doing. And so when I came into leadership of the foundation, while I don't come from an investment background, I was like, well, we're going to have a closer look at this with our investment committee, with our board, with our staff, and say, how can we put that 95% to work for our communities, to help communities build power and leverage change opportunities. So the thing at the foundation now that I love our grant making, but I want to make our investments feel like our grant making. And so bringing together that opportunity to do more impact investing with our endowment in alignment with our values and grant making has been something that I've been really passionate about the past couple of years.
Yeah, what an exciting opportunity. And again, I think that proximity and your unique perspective, it sounds like really equipped you to not only come with that motivation, but with a sense of what that would mean and how that could be accomplished. Really exciting.
I'm curious from like two perspectives. One, if somebody wanted to start like a community-based foundation, what would that look like? When the New York Foundation was started, I don't know how many years ago did you say?
Over 1909. So you do the math, like getting close to 120.
Yeah. So who came together, right, to kind of pull those resources together to start the foundation? What did that look like?
Oh, I love this that you're asking this question, because another thing that we've been doing as a foundation is understanding not just our history and how we were started, but what the source of our wealth is actually from. And so the New York Foundation started with two brothers, the Heinsheimers, in 1909. When one of the brothers passed away in his will, he said, I want to endow a foundation, basically creating a Jewish federation of organizations. They were German Jews who immigrated to the US, were based here, really wanted these organizations to federate to become a stronger organization altogether in their collective efforts. They had 1 year to do it, and they weren't able to federate in that time. So instead what happened was the New York Foundation was created. They still supported many of those organizations as well at that time, but that was the first endowed gift that started the foundation. And then there were several gifts shortly thereafter that, from people who left the New York Foundation money in their wills, bequests, because they deeply, deeply cared about the future of the city and the strong belief that everyday people actually can create change and will make this a vibrant and inclusive city. So that's the early story. But where are we, like, what's the story behind that?
Right.
And so when we were developing our new investment policy statement, and so for those that are wondering, like, well, that sounds boring. What's an ideate? Yes. The short of it is it's how you articulate your strategies and values on how you invest that 95% I just talked about, right? So when we were changing our investment strategy, we decided, of course, we're going to have to revise our IPS. And one thing that was important to me beyond the investment strategy and values was we had a preamble that actually talked about the source of our wealth. And when we talk about the source of our wealth, particularly in that period of time, but even now, we can acknowledge past harms. We can and talk about how that's going to influence our grant making and investments moving forward. So I, of course, could tell you the long story of the source of some of our wealth, but I'll just say they were primarily bankers, is where the source of the wealth came from. And much of what the founders were invested in were things like railroad expansion, right? And so I'm sure I don't need to tell my listeners or your listeners, my friends that are listening, that was a very brutal industry, both for workers, displaced people, indigenous people, former slaves. And so when we talk about how that source of wealth was generated for the foundation and name that truth, we can now think about how to repair some of those past harms with the tools we do have, which is our resources, which is why we explicitly focus both in our grant making and now with our investments in BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color led organizations, because we can understand that the source of our wealth came through their exploitation and extraction.
Yeah, it's really powerful. I think that historical perspective is so critical when we pay homage to it and looking forward. From where you sit, what does an inclusive New York City look like? Like if you could design New York City, what would it look like if it were an inclusive city?
It's what I think about every day.
Yeah.
Right? I hope it's what we all think about. This is the place that you live or wherever you live. I think about public policies that signal that this city is a place for belonging where everyone can live, work, and play. I think about municipal budgets that signal those values too, by how like we can prioritize care, not cuts, right? That people are getting the resources they need to thrive in their communities. And I think about ultimately an economy that prioritizes cooperation, not competition. And that's a tall order, right? That's easier said than done, but it just goes back to what I believe in and why I work at the New York Foundation, why I come out of organizing, is that that's not going to happen unless people are coming together to build power to make those things true. And so the things that I just outlined, right, just as a few, like I can talk about one of our grantees, the New Economy Project, or another grantee, the People's Plan, that are doing that every day, creating new narratives about what's possible in a city like New York City. And so I'm just really passionate about rethinking like what's possible, and that organizing really is ultimately about people coming together because they believe they can make new worlds possible. And so to me, that's an inclusive New York City.
Thank you.
I'm so curious if you can talk us through the kind of power that you can provide access to nonprofits, right? I think there are nonprofits or there are organizers you brought up. You said you got your first grant, you didn't understand that world. If you can talk us through like what it means to work with the foundation, what it means to work with individuals who want to drive that work forward.
You know, this is why I do this work, because when I'm meeting with a group, even though, I was meeting with a grantee a couple weeks ago in the Bronx, a startup nonprofit in the Bronx, and they were shocked that I was at the meeting, that I was the one meeting with them to learn more about their work. They were like, we thought it was a typo saying that you, the president, were coming. We thought that was just like a mistake. And I was like, no, I'm the one here to meet with you because I really care about your work, because knowing who you are, knowing your challenges, knowing how I and the foundation can support you is what makes me better at my job. And so at the very least, like you said earlier, Lenore, was knowing that you come from this work, knowing that you've been a grant seeker, helping you be a better grant maker is so key. So to me is breaking down barriers, breaking down myths, being more transparent and democratic grant making institution is super important to us, and a value that we are accessible is super important. And so I want to meet the most exciting part of my job. Yes, the investments I talked about, but reality is that my why. I'm in this because I believe in communities and I believe in the leaders of organizations that maybe other funders aren't giving a first look to because they're seen as so-called risky, because they maybe have not been funded before. I want us to be that foundation that's saying like, we believe in you. And what's more risky to me is not funding groups that are doing powerful work in their communities. I guess maybe just leave you with this. Like, I remember as an organizer, eventually a person running a nonprofit that had to raise the money, we took a lot of pride in saying we could do so much with so little, because we weren't getting much funding. And I want to flip the script on that.
Yeah.
Right? Like I want to invest in these grassroots organizations, not because they can get by with so little. I want to make sure they have everything they need.
Right.
Because if they can win as much as they're winning with so few resources, can you imagine what else is possible?
Right.
So that's what motivates me.
I love that paradigm
Imagine the
shift.
world.
Thank you for that. So what other ways are you building an inclusive world that people might not know by Googling you?
So I'm going to use my airtime, just given where we are with recently concluded March Madness basketball,
Yes.
and the start of another basketball season coming up soon. I want to say that I'm a huge women's sports fan, and in particular, women's college basketball and the WNBA. I'm a season ticket holder for the New York Liberty.
Okay.
Yes.
season ticket holder.
Proud season ticket holder.
Oh my gosh.
I'm bringing this up to say, like, if anyone's reading the news, I'm sure you are. You're seeing the hype around the growth of women's college basketball in particular, but also women's basketball generally, including women's professional basketball. And why I bring this up for that question, building a more inclusive world. Like I'm looking at the organizing that's happening around making sure women's sports is getting the airtime it deserves.
Yeah.
The players and professional players are having the opportunity to grow and earn a living in this sport compared to their male counterparts. But of course, all of that is true. I love the organizing and that work that's happening around equity and racial equity in particular in women's basketball. But I have to say, just watch.
Yeah.
Just watch these games.
Yeah.
Come to a New York Liberty game with me. Like tune into the next women's college basketball playoffs next year. They exceeded the men's college basketball viewership.
Wow.
And were actually the most watched game in history. Women or men over this past tournament playoff series. So
Okay. I gotta catch
promoting women's college basketball, great sport, and just really, really great organizing happening in that space as well.
up. Thanks for the tip.
I want to hit hard that those Caitlin Clark tickets are like triple.
Let me tell you, the opening game for New York Liberty is against the Indiana Fever, which Caitlin Clark, of course, was just drafted as a number 1 overall pick.
Yeah.
And I went to look just to see, like, hey, if I were to resell my ticket,
Right.
my season ticket, I, of course, will not be doing that. I will be going and attending with a friend. But wow. And this
Probably
this
can pay for the
moment,
whole set of season
it
tickets.
can probably pay for the whole season tickets, but I will not do that because I want to enjoy the game. But yes, so shout out to women's college basketball fans and would-be fans. I hope it's more people.
No, I'm based in Washington. I looked at the Mystics ticket when the people were coming to town, and I was like, I this is more than most NBA tickets. I paid for a ticket with LeBron James. It was cheaper to see LeBron James than it is to see Clay Clark.
Okay.
It's hilarious, like how the growth is really taking place.
I love
Wonderful.
that. I love that.
Yeah. The last thing, how can folks get involved with your work? How can they plug into what the New York Foundation is trying to accomplish?
Well, of course, you can check us out at nyf.org, but really what I think is more important is not the foundation, but the work that we support. Check out our grantees. They're probably, if you're here in New York City, I guarantee you there's a group that we're supporting that's in your hyper-local neighborhood. If you're not in New York City, you don't have to think about the New York Foundation. I guarantee you there's another community foundation where you're at. Get to know that foundation because they're on the ground. They're closest to the work, and they can help you figure out what's happening in your neighborhood, how you can get involved, and maybe how you can support a nonprofit that's building power in your community.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Great advice. Thank you, Ricke.
Great to be here.
That wraps up this episode of Market Makers. A huge thank you to Ricke Mananzala for joining us. So why did we name this Market Makers? In the world of finance, making a market means you brought together a buyer and a seller that would not have gotten a transaction done without you. You help them agree to a price, settled at the price, and close the transaction. The people we interview make markets every day. They bridge communities, ideas, partnerships, and people from seemingly disparate backgrounds and causes to forge a new world. As Ricke said, people, power, and capital can be transformative. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with others who are passionate about creating a more inclusive and impactful marketplace. You can follow us at ImpactAlpha and wherever else you listen to podcasts to hear more upcoming episodes. Thanks again for tuning into the Market Makers podcast.